Alright, so today we are testing the Radeon RX 7600 in Alan Wake 2. Now I just wanted to do a quick video on Alan Wake 2 where we tested AFMF. We'll be testing that throughout the whole game. But we'll be testing at 1080p, 1440p, and maybe 4K. Let's see how it goes. Right, so the system I'll be testing it with today is a 12600K CPU that's paired with 16 gigabytes of DDR4 3600 MHz CL18 memory. All the specs are on the screen right now. Now, let's just go over the settings here. I'm going to get one thing right out of the way. We are at 1080p native at the moment on the low preset. And I'll be testing ray tracing first. So we'll just enable the low preset for ray tracing and no path tracing. I just want to show you that unfortunately, if you've got a Radeon GPU or a 7600, ray tracing in this game is not going to work. We are getting 18 frames per second here at native. That's without path tracing. That's on the low preset. And then if we just drop the render resolution down all the way to 360p on ultra performance, right? Still, I mean, the game just looks terrible. You can't really make out anything in movement, and we're getting 43 frames per second. So a very inconsistent frame time graph as well. This is not the way you should be playing this game. Right, so 7600, just look at his face. I mean, when you move it, I don't know, there's just, it doesn't look good. All right, so 7600 with ray tracing, definitely out of the question. And then if we enable path tracing here, and this will just be a very quick test anyway, and we'll just enable path tracing down here, just on the low preset as well. And now we are getting, I mean, if you want 30 frames per second, then you can definitely play like this, although you won't be seeing what's going on here. I mean, you can literally count the pixels in the reflection there. All right, so now that we've got that out of the way, let's go on to the low preset here at 1080p, but this time at native. I'll enable AFMF now as well. Let me just get rid of this. All right, so we're at 1080p native. Even though FSR there is underlined, you can't change it. So it uses FSR AA. And we'll just go on to the low preset here. So I'm not going to change everything to low. I mean, there are some settings we can change down to low as well. Some of them don't really impact performance at all, like scattered object density doesn't really make a difference. And let's just make sure that ray tracing is disabled as well. All right, so on the low preset, 1080p native, and just want to enable AFMF as well, but you can see we're getting around 55 frames per second here. It's not the most stable image though. You can see that it's flickering quite a lot, and this is actually where DLSS performed quite a bit better. Right, just to enable AFMF here. So you can see you can just enable AFMF and it'll show that its frame generation status is active. Now this is the October 17, October 13, I don't know, the latest tech preview driver. It's not really supported for Alan Wake, but I didn't really see that big a difference with the WHQL driver in this game. But just keep in mind that it is a tech driver and it's not officially supported. But we've got two numbers on the screen now. On the right hand side, we've got the AFMF frame rate, 106 frames per second. And then on the left, we've got the normal frame rate without AFMF. Just I'm going to show both so you can make up your mind whether you want to play with the AFMF or not. It's literally double the frame rate. All right, so we'll just start capturing our benchmark numbers here. This is actually not terrible. The input latency is pretty good, even though we're getting around 55 frames per second. We're basically on the verge of being able to enable frame generation or AFMF based on AMD's recommendations. They do say that minimum of 55 frames per second is recommended, but 10% here and there is not really going to make that big a difference. Right, so you can see without AFMF, we're getting around 55 frames per second, and with AFMF, we're getting 110 frames per second. And now I'm running the exact same benchmark as in my previous videos. Sorry if you're bored of that, but I need to do this to be able to make fair comparisons. But you can see we're not getting 60 frames per second even at a native on the low preset, right? We will need to use FSR, and I did find FSR quality to be pretty much giving us a solid 60 frames per second, but we'll test that out right now. Right, these guys are just talking a lot of nonsense. So you can see our frame rate average there was 55 frames per second, so 110 frames per second. I'm not entirely sure if you can actually double the 1% lows or 0.1% lows. There's no way of actually capturing that with the Radeon overlay, as far as I'm aware. If there is, maybe just comment down below, maybe help me out here. Right, so 55 frames per second with the 1080p native on the low preset. Let's enable FSR quality. Right, we've got FSR quality, and you can see that our frame rate basically increased with around 20 frames per second, and the image is a little bit soft, but it does appear to be slightly more stable. Maybe the wind is just not blowing as much, but right, so getting 70 frames per second, give or take. The only reason why I'm giving you both numbers is if you don't want to play with AFMF enabled, then you'll see what kind of performance you're getting, right? This is actually a perfect game for AFMF because it's not really a fast-paced game, so AFMF should not disable frame generation that often at all. I played with this for a little bit, even in combat. I didn't actually see AFMF disabling. Moving the camera around, like there you can see it drops it, right? But it comes back very quickly. And I mean, if you just if you play the game normally, like it's not going to drop at all, right? But that's just my experience. But you can see our frame rate average increased by around 20 frames per second without AFMF enabled. FSR quality over native. So this is probably where I'd play this game if I decided to play it without AFMF. As I said, I'd personally played with AFMF. It's pretty good with it enabled, and I mean, it's definitely not the worst experience. It's not the best looking FSR quality, meaning 720p upscale to 1080p, but if you want a constant 60 frames per second, then unfortunately that's what you'll need to do. All right, let's move on to the medium preset. First, we'll just go back to native, and then we'll enable the medium preset here. As I said, we're not going to be testing any ray tracing for obvious reasons, and let's just enable a frame rate counter there. And now you can see we're getting 35 frames per second. Now, what I found with the previous videos I made with the RX 4060 and 4070, getting around 40 frames per second, it's still fine to enable frame generation. For some reason, the input latency just doesn't feel that bad compared to other games that are getting a lower base frame rate. Over here, it's also not bad because remember, AFMF is a frame generation. It's just not FSR 3. This works on a driver level. So you will see some UI artifacting if you've got a crosshair, which I don't have at the moment. I had to restart the game to get back to this specific area. Anyway, it doesn't really matter. Do we have a crosshair? No, we don't. So as you can see, 1080p on the medium preset getting you around 40 frames per second. Now, if you are one of those that prefer to play at 30 frames per second or don't mind to play at 30 frames per second, then these settings, I mean, it's definitely usable. And if you do lock your frame rate to 30 frames per second, you'll get a very, very solid, consistent experience. Right, personally, I wouldn't play like that. I tried 30 frames per second in this game. Yeah, that's not going to work for me. Anyway, so we got around 47 frames per second. You'll see that the 1% and 0.1% lows aren't really that terrible. It just means that there's very little stuttering in this game. And that's true. Just one other thing that I need to mention is that the performance in town is much better. I just wanted to test this area to give you the worst case scenario so as not to get your hopes up. So if you can fine tune your settings so that you get 60 frames per second in this specific area, you will be guaranteed 60 frames per second like 98% of the time. All right, so let's just see if we can actually get 60 frames per second on the medium preset without having to use too aggressive upscaling. I think let's just go with quality and see what happens here. Let me just reset the numbers. And I think this would actually be okay. On medium, it definitely looks much better. I mean, just the reflections and the shadows, like the resolution of the reflections look much better. There's a lot less graininess going on there. And we are getting around 60 frames per second. Now, it'll definitely drop below 60 frames per second like there. But not the end of the world if you're aiming for 60 frames per second. I mean, I don't think you'd mind 5 frames per second drop here and there, unless you don't have a VRAM monitor. You're locking a frame rate to 60 frames per second, and you get tearing when it goes below that. Other than that, this is actually not too terrible. And you can see with AFMF on, we've got around 120 frames per second. So that means that if you do have a 144 hertz monitor, you can probably max that out with these settings and still get a pretty good experience, right? It's definitely not a bad experience when it comes to input latency either. Like, you don't really feel it that much, and being a slow-paced third-person game, I don't think the input latency would be a concern for many. All right, let's move on to the high preset. We'll just go, I don't think we'll be testing it native on the high preset, so we'll just leave FSR quality on here and high. I mean, there are many settings that you can still increase here. This is just a preset, like it's just a name, doesn't really mean much. Anyway, so we've got FSR set to quality, so 720p internal resolution, still no ray tracing, and off we go. Let's just get our numbers back up here, if I can remember the combination, and there we go. I know it sounds very stupid to forget the combination, but this is a 60% keyboard, so I have to press Alt and function and all that kind of nonsense. Anyway, you can see that there's not that big a performance gap between medium and high. It's maybe 10%, I'd say. I mean, we were getting around 55 frames per second in this specific area, and then it went back up to 60. So, I mean, even here we're getting 65. And if you do play with AFMF on, input latency is pretty good, getting around 100, 110 frames per second. Unless you move the mouse around a lot, then AFMF gets disabled. But as I said, just, I mean, playing the game normally, that probably wouldn't happen too much. All right, so this is actually not terrible. I mean, I'd expect a little bit worse, seeing that we struggled to get 60 frames per second on the low preset, and then with FSR on the medium preset, it was a touch and go there. But on the high preset, this is definitely playable. I think this is where I'd personally play this game. All right, that's enough for 1080p. Let's move on to 1440p. All right, we're now at 1440p. I've re-enabled the low preset here. No ray tracing, no upscaling whatsoever. So let's see how this goes. Just reset our numbers once again. There we go, got the right combination going, and we're getting 28 frames per second. But just look at that frame time graph. That's terrible. I think we might be getting close to our VRAM buffer here, although it only shows 6.5 gigabytes of VRAM used. This is not a good experience. With AFMF enabled as well, the input latency is pretty bad, but we are getting around 30 frames per second, right? So it definitely looks much better than at 1080p, but the performance is sorely lacking. With AFMF, as I said, the input latency is pretty bad, but if you don't want to play with AFMF, you'll get around 30 frames per second. Your input latency will definitely be better without AFMF. These are lower frame rates, and the image quality should be a little bit better as well. We're not focusing on image quality at all in these videos, only performance. The image quality might not look the best with AFMF enabled with these settings, but we're just looking at the numbers. All right, so I mean, we've got 30 frames per second here. So let's see what we actually need to do to get 60 frames per second. Right, so I played around a little bit, and this is the only one that got me close to 60 on performance, FSR performance. So once again, 720p, so this is basically the same internal resolution as FSR quality at 1080p. Anyway, still on the low preset, and we are getting around 60 frames per second, but the game does look pretty bad, I'm not going to lie. But once again, you can actually get away with this because now we are around that 55 frames per second that AMD recommends for AFMF. You can see AFMF is getting us around 120 frames per second. Right, it doesn't look great, but if you don't mind that and you just want 120 frames per second to max out or get close to maxing out your 144 hertz panel, then these are the settings that you can use. Otherwise, if you don't play with AFMF, you're getting around 60 frames per second. And I mean, I personally would play with AFMF on at these settings, but I don't think like 1440p on this RX 7600, there's just a lot of compromises that you have to make. It's very aggressive upscaling 720p going to 1440p, so that's like half resolution, right? The upscaler needs to do a lot of work, and I can only guess that it'll definitely mess some things up. Alright, but we got a solid 60 frames per second, and the frame time graph is definitely much better than it was at native. Alright, I don't think there's much we can actually do here at 1440p. Let's see. I'm just going to go onto the medium preset just to give you an idea of what the performance is like. So we're now on the medium preset. These are still set to low, but you can see it's a mix and match of high, ultra, low, and medium settings. So once again, this is just a name. Doesn't mean that everything is set to medium or everything is set to high. So let's see what the performance is like now. And I mean, it's not terrible. We lost around 10 to 15% in performance here. The frame time graph seems to behave, and our VRAM usage is sitting at 6.6 gigabyte. The input latency is still not terrible, actually, getting around 100 frames per second there with AFMF. Now the frame time graph is becoming pretty choppy, and that just translates to some micro stuttering. It's kind of distracting. It's I don't know if it'll come across in the YouTube video, but it's just that like it looks like some frames are being skipped. Like you are in one place and then like it looks like a frame is being skipped and suddenly you're in the next frame. I don't know how to explain it, and English is not my native language. That's the best way I can think of it. Anyway, so maybe the medium preset is not the way to go, even with FSR on pretty aggressive upscaling settings, yeah. And it also depends on where you actually look. Sometimes it does look, let's just look down there, and the frame time graph, it smooths quite a lot, but as soon as you turn, I don't know. Right, this was just not a very good experience, so I'd recommend not playing on the medium preset with 1440p. Alright, so I think that's it for 1440p. Now let's see if we can actually get a playable frame rate at 4K. Yeah. Right, we're at 4K native on the low preset here, and the menu only just now started responding. It's pretty slow. Now, I don't know if you've watched my 4060 video. I'd urge you to do that. You could see that the 4060 was just running out of VRAM. It was quite funny, like this. And there we go. Like, I don't know, it's not just that the terrain is not rendering or the textures aren't rendering. Like, the terrain just does pretty funky stuff. Alright, so 4K native. Sorry, let's just have a look at the performance numbers. They're getting 10 frames per second, and I know the VRAM allocation says 8 gig and the VRAM usage says 7.3 gigabytes, but there's probably some other applications or system resources using a little bit of VRAM. But alright, so this was not unexpected at all. I just want to get that out there. I'm not expecting this 8 gigabyte GPU to do 4K at all. So let's just let's do the render resolution at I think we'll have to go down to ultra performance here, even on the low preset, right, just to get some playable frame rate here. And you can see we're getting now 50 frames per second, 105 with AFMF, but I do think we'll probably run into the same frame time issues. Let's just reset our numbers here to get a average and everything recorded here. Surprisingly, we're not really having the same issues with the frame time as at 1440p on the medium preset, right? So actually, frame rate wise, it's not bad. The input latency definitely not bad. I did not expect us to be able to hit 50 frames per second, yeah. Now, if you're not playing this with AFMF, unfortunately, you're not going to be hitting 60 frames per second at 4K. I mean, as I said, this is a very, very demanding area of the woods. In town, you'll probably get around 70 frames per second with these exact same settings. It's just that some other areas are pretty demanding as well the further you go into the game. So as I said, I just wanted to give you the worst case scenario so that you don't expect 75 frames per second and then suddenly you get to the demanding area and you're only getting 50 frames per second, right? So, I mean, this is actually not terrible. I'd play like this if my main monitor was a 4K monitor. I'd rather have the GPU do the upscaling than the monitor. It'll look much better. Alright, so that's going to be it for our RX 7600 video. I hope you guys enjoyed it. If you did, hit that like button, hit that subscribe button, and as always, we hope to see you in the next one.